February 24, 2022, a date etched into the collective memory of the 21st century, a day that began with the chilling announcement of a special military operation, a euphemism for the largest conventional military invasion in Europe since the Second World War. In our timeline, the world witnessed a story of fierce, defiant resistance. The Ukrainian people, against all odds, halted the advance of what was considered the world's second most powerful army. The battle for Kiev became a symbol of national courage, a testament to a nation's will to exist. President Volodymyr Zelensky, in his military green t-shirt, became an icon of defiance, his words, "I need ammunition, not a ride," echoing across the globe. But history is a fragile thing. It turns on moments, on decisions, on 100 small, unforeseen variables. A stalled convoy, a failure of logistics, a moment of hesitation, a surge of unexpected morale. For Ukraine, these moments turn the tide. But what if they hadn't? What if the 40-mile convoy of Russian armor had not faltered? What if the initial shock and awe had been as effective as the Kremlin had planned? What if the story had gone the other way? This is not the world you know. This is a journey into a world that could have been. A world where the blue and yellow flag of Ukraine was lowered from the Verkhovna Rada, and the tricolour of the Russian Federation was raised in its place. In this alternate timeline, the battle for Kiev was not a story of Ukrainian victory, but a swift, brutal, and decisive Russian triumph. The initial Russian strategy, predicated on a lightning-fast decapitation of the Ukrainian government, succeeded beyond even their own expectations. Special forces inserted into the capital in the earliest hours managed to secure key government buildings. Communications were severed. Confusion and chaos reigned. In our world, President Zelensky's defiant videos from the streets of Kiev galvanized his people and the international community. But in this world, those videos never came. Before he could become a global symbol of resistance, he was captured in the first 48 hours. A grainy photograph released by Russian state media showed a haggard and defeated Zelensky in custody. The psychological blow to the Ukrainian people was immeasurable. With their leader gone and their capital in enemy hands, the organized Ukrainian military resistance fractured. Pockets of fierce fighting continued for weeks in the west, in the forests and cities that have historically been the heartland of Ukrainian nationalism. But without a central command, without the steady flow of Western arms that would have been crucial, these pockets were isolated, surrounded, and systematically crushed. Within a month, the war as a conventional conflict was over. Russia had won. A puppet government was installed in Kiev, composed of pro-Russian Ukrainian politicians who had been waiting in the wings. They spoke of liberation, of brotherly reunion, and of the end of a neo-Nazi regime. The world watched, stunned and horrified, as a sovereign European nation was extinguished in the early years of the 21st century. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence. The shockwaves of this victory rippled outwards, far beyond the newly drawn borders of a diminished Europe. The carefully constructed post-Cold War order, already fragile, was shattered. Assumptions about international law, the sanctity of borders, and the strength of Western resolve were all called into question. We are now in the year 2025. The world has had 3 years to live with the consequences of this alternate reality. The dust of the initial conflict has settled, but what has risen in its place is a new, more dangerous world. A world where might has proven right, where aggression has been rewarded, and where the spectre of a new, colder, and more volatile war haunts the globe. This is the story of that world, the world after the fall of Ukraine, a world where the question is no longer if another war will come, but when and where. This is what happens when a nation falls and the world is forced to watch. Victory in modern warfare is often measured not in territory gained, but in the speed at which an opponent's will to fight is broken. In the world we know, the Ukrainian will prove to be unbreakable, but in this reality it was shattered in the first 100 hours. The Russian blitzkrieg, the udar or shock, that the Kremlin had envisioned was not a failure of logistics and morale, but a terrifyingly precise and brutal success. The turning point came at Hostomel Airport, a cargo airfield on the northwestern outskirts of Kyiv. In our timeline, a ferocious Ukrainian counterattack decimated the elite Russian VDV paratroopers who had seized it, denying Russia a vital air bridge into the capital. Here, that counterattack never fully materialized. A more effective initial wave of cyber warfare had sowed chaos in the Ukrainian command structure. Orders were delayed, units were misdirected, and for a few critical hours, the defenders of Kyiv were fighting blind. That window was all the VDV needed. They repelled the initial, piecemeal Ukrainian assaults and held the perimeter. Within 6 hours of the invasion start, the first of dozens of Ilyushin Il-76 transport planes began to land, disgorging not just more paratroopers, but light armored vehicles, mobile artillery, and specialists in urban warfare. The air bridge was open. The siege of Kyiv had begun before its citizens had even fully understood they were at war. While the noose tightened around Kyiv, a second, equally critical failure was unfolding within the city itself. In the real world, Russian intelligence had grossly underestimated the loyalty and effectiveness of Ukraine's security services. In this timeline, the infiltration was deeper. Sleeper cells, activated in the first hour, targeted communication nodes and sabotaged transport links. More devastatingly, they provided real-time intelligence on the location of the Ukrainian leadership. President Zelensky's defiant broadcasts from his phone, which became the defining images of Ukrainian resistance, were cut short. Before he could become a global icon, his location was compromised. A swift, brutal raid on the presidential compound in the second day of the war ended with his capture. The news was not released through a triumphant press conference, but a cold, calculated leak. A single, grainy photo of a defeated president in Russian custody, which spread across the world like wildfire. The psychological impact was catastrophic. The symbol of resistance had been extinguished. With their leader gone, their capital encircled, and Russian forces pouring in from the north, east, and south, the Ukrainian military's command structure collapsed. Heroic, desperate stands took place across the country. The defenders of Kharkiv, of Mariupol, of Chernihiv fought with incredible bravery, but their struggles were isolated, uncoordinated. They were islands of resistance in a sea of Russian military might, and one by one they were submerged. Within 3 weeks, the battle for Kyiv was over. The city was not flattened in the way Grozny or Aleppo had been. The Russian strategy was to capture it intact, but the occupation was suffocating. Checkpoints manned by grim-faced Rosgvardia, the Russian National Guard, sprang up on every major intersection. A strict curfew was imposed. The vibrant European metropolis fell into a fearful silence, punctuated by the rumble of patrols and the wail of distant sirens. The political consolidation was just as swift. On the steps of the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, a figure from the nation's pro-Russian past, Viktor Medvedchuk, announced the formation of a provisional committee for national salvation. Flanked by other pro-Kremlin figures and guarded by Russian soldiers, he spoke of ending the fratricidal war, restoring brotherly ties with Russia, and purging the nation of the foreign-backed Nazi elements that had led it to ruin. The blue and yellow flag was lowered, and the white, blue, and red of the Russian Federation was hoisted in its place. Ukraine, as an independent state, had ceased to exist. For the Ukrainian people, the end of the war was the beginning of a nightmare. The denazification program was not mere rhetoric, it was a brutal, systematic purge. Filtration camps were established on the outskirts of major cities. Tens of thousands were rounded up. Soldiers, politicians, journalists, academics, artists, and civil society activists. Anyone who had been vocal in their support for Ukrainian sovereignty or had ties to the post-2014 government was a target. Disappearances became a nightly occurrence. A climate of terror not seen in Europe for generations took hold. As the reality of the occupation set in, the initial trickle of refugees became a flood, then a torrent. The fall of the government had extinguished any hope of a reversal of fortune. The choice was stark: live under occupation or flee. Millions chose to flee, an immense river of Humanity began to flow west, towards Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia. It was a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale that dwarfed anything Europe had witnessed since 1945. The European Union, which had been preparing sanctions and military aid, was now confronted with a crisis of an entirely different magnitude. The refugee wave strained social services to the breaking point. Political tensions flared as nations struggled to cope with the influx. The crisis dominated every news cycle, every political debate. The moral imperative to help was clear, but the practical and political challenges were immense, creating deep fissures within the EU itself. Back in what was once Ukraine, the final pieces of the new order were being locked into place. The remnants of the Ukrainian army were formally disbanded. Russian military bases were made permanent, not just in the east and south, but in the center and west, placing the Russian army directly on the borders of 3 NATO states. The nation was being transformed into a vast, militarized buffer zone, a glacis to protect Russia's western flank and project its power deep into Europe. The Kremlin's ultimate goal became clear. Ukraine was to be absorbed into the Union state, a formal alliance with Russia and Belarus, erasing its identity and binding it permanently to Moscow's orbit. The fall of Ukraine was not just the end of a country, it was the first violent redrawing of the map of the 21st century, and it would not be the last. If you're enjoying this journey into alternate history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more thoughtful explorations. Now let's continue where we left off. If the fall of Kiev was an earthquake, its aftershocks hit Europe with the force of a tsunami. The institutions built to ensure peace and prosperity on the continent for over 70 years were suddenly confronted with a reality they were designed to prevent, but not equipped to handle. The initial reaction was not one of resolute unity, but of stunned systemic shock. For decades, European policy had been predicated on the assumption that large-scale conventional war on its borders was a thing of the past. That assumption was now buried under the rubble of a fallen Kiev. In Brussels, Berlin, and Paris, emergency summits were convened, but the agendas once filled with discussions of sanctions and condemnation were now obsolete. How do you sanction a victor who holds all the cards? The West had prepared a playbook for a long, drawn-out conflict where economic pressure could be slowly applied. They had no playbook for a swift, decisive defeat. The sanctions that were enacted felt hollow, a desperate gesture against a Russia that was now flush with the spoils of war, Ukraine's industrial heartland, its vast agricultural resources, and most critically, its energy transit infrastructure. The psychological blow was profound. The sense of security that had defined post-Cold War Europe evaporated overnight. On the television screens of citizens in Lisbon and Dublin, the war might still feel distant, but in Warsaw, Vilnius, and Tallinn, it felt like it was in the next village. The fall of Ukraine was not an abstract geopolitical event. It was the chilling prologue to what they feared would be their own story. A new, terrifyingly tangible Iron Curtain had descended, not in the center of Germany, but right on their eastern borders. For Poland and the Baltic states, the world had been turned upside down. They were no longer the eastern flank of NATO, they were the front line of a new Cold War. The tripwire forces stationed there meant to deter an attack suddenly seemed like a sacrificial offering. A panicked, frantic reinforcement began. The United States, shaking off its own strategic shock, airlifted the 82nd Airborne into Poland. Convoys of German Leopards and British Challengers rumbled across the autobahns towards the east, but this was not a confident show of force. It was a desperate scramble to plug a dam that had already burst. Public life in these nations changed irrevocably. Civil defense drills became a common sight. Gun sales surged. The grim, defiant spirit of populations that had lived under Soviet domination for half a century was reawakened. Every Russian military exercise across the border was seen as a potential prelude to invasion. While the military balance of power shifted, an even more potent weapon was being wielded by Moscow with surgical precision. Energy. With full control of Ukraine's vast network of pipelines, Russia's stranglehold on Europe's gas and oil supply became absolute. The Kremlin didn't need to turn off the taps completely. The threat was enough. Unscheduled maintenance in the middle of a cold snap. A mysterious pipeline leak that took weeks to repair. A sudden demand to renegotiate contracts with a new state-owned energy giant that had absorbed Ukraine's naftogaz. The European energy crisis, already a serious concern before the war, became a permanent economic catastrophe. Germany, the industrial engine of the continent, saw its manufacturing sector crippled. Energy-intensive industries like chemical production and steelmaking faced shutdowns and mass layoffs. Governments imposed strict energy rationing. In the winter of 2023, thermostats in public buildings were limited to 19 degrees Celsius. Cities fell dark as streetlights were dimmed to save power. The dream of a smooth green transition died as nations desperately fired up old coal and nuclear plants they had been on the verge of decommissioning. The economic pain was immense, and it began to tear at the very fabric of European society. Compounding the economic crisis was the human one. The wave of refugees from occupied Ukraine was relentless. In the first year alone, over 12 million people poured across the EU's eastern borders, a desperate exodus of a nation's soul. Poland, a country of 38 million, received over 4 million refugees. Germany took in 2 million. The initial outpouring of solidarity and compassion was extraordinary, a testament to European values. But as the months turned into years, and the temporary shelters became semi-permanent refugee towns, the strain began to show. Schools were overcrowded, healthcare systems buckled, and the social welfare budgets of host nations were stretched to their absolute limits. And this is where the political poison began to seep in. The twin crises of economic hardship and mass migration created fertile ground for the growth of right-wing populism. Charismatic leaders across the continent rose, channeling the public's fear and resentment into a potent political force. Their message was simple, seductive, and dangerous. They argued that the establishment leaders in Brussels and Berlin had provoked Russia with NATO expansion. They claimed that the economic pain was a self-inflicted wound, and they stoked fears that the wave of Ukrainian refugees was a threat to national identity and security. Their solution: end the confrontation with Russia, lift the sanctions, make a deal, secure cheap energy again, and close the borders. This narrative gained traction, not just on the fringes, but in the mainstream. A deep, bitter division split the European Union. In the East, leaders from Poland, the Baltics, and the Czech Republic saw any talk of negotiation as treasonous appeasement. They demanded a full-scale militarization of the border, a complete decoupling from the Russian economy, and a hardline stance, regardless of the cost. In the West, particularly in France, Italy, and a deeply wounded Germany, the calculus was different. Under pressure from their struggling industries and the rising populist right, leaders began to speak of realism and the need for a new security architecture that included, rather than isolated, Russia. The EU, once a symbol of unity, became a cauldron of acrimony. Summits that were meant to forge a common strategy devolved into shouting matches. The Franco-German engine that had driven European integration for decades sputtered and stalled. Europe was in shock, but it was not a shock that brought it together. It was a shock that was breaking it apart, forcing each nation to look inward, to question its alliances, and to wonder, in the long, cold nights of a continent dimmed by energy shortages and fear, who would be next.
The security of the alliance is indivisible. Any attack against one ally will be regarded as an attack against all.
In the cold, sterile halls of NATO headquarters in Brussels, a ghost had returned. It was the ghost of the Fulda Gap, of the Cold War nightmares of Soviet tank armies pouring into Western Europe. For 30 years, that ghost had been banished, a relic of a bygone era, but the fall of Ukraine had given it a new, terrifying form. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the most successful military alliance in human history, was now facing the single greatest test of its existence. a crisis of credibility. The core promise of NATO is deceptively simple. An attack on one is an attack on all. This principle, enshrined in Article 5 of its founding treaty, had been the bedrock of European security for over 70 years. It had never been truly tested against a peer adversary. Now, with the Russian army sitting on the borders of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the question that was once academic was now being asked in hushed, terrified whispers in every capital. Is Article 5 a promise, or is it a bluff? The first emergency summit after the fall of Kiev laid bare the deep, venomous fractures that had been papered over for years. The alliance did not react as a single, unified bloc. It splintered into factions, each driven by its own geography, history, and fear. On one side were the hawks, the frontline states. Poland's prime minister, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fury, argued for nothing less than a full-scale mobilization of NATO forces, the permanent stationing of 500,000 troops on the eastern flank, and a complete severing of all economic and diplomatic ties with Moscow. The representatives from the Baltic states, whose nations now existed in the shadow of a triumphant Russian military, echoed his call. For them, this was 1939 all over again. They saw compromise as suicide and dialogue as appeasement. On the other side were the realists, or as the hawks called them, the appeasers. Led by France and a deeply wounded Germany, they stared into the abyss of a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia and recoiled in horror. Their economies were already in freefall from the energy crisis. Their societies were being destabilized by the refugee wave and the rise of the populist right. They argued that while reinforcing the East was necessary, provoking a now confident and aggressive Russia was madness. The German chancellor spoke of the need for an off-ramp, for a new grand bargain that could stabilize the continent, even if it meant tacitly accepting the new reality in Ukraine. This was seen as a profound betrayal by the East, a sign that the old powers of Europe were willing to sacrifice the new members to save themselves. The word solidarity was repeated endlessly in press conferences, but in the closed-door meetings it had lost all meaning. All eyes, as always in times of crisis, turned to Washington. The United States was the ultimate guarantor of the alliance, the military superpower that gave Article 5 its teeth. But the America of 2025 was not the America of 1955. It was a nation weary of foreign entanglement, haunted by the long, inconclusive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and deeply divided against itself. The Russian victory in Ukraine did not unite the American public, it split it even further. An invigorated America First movement, which had been a powerful force in domestic politics, found a potent new cause. Its leaders and media surrogates asked a simple, powerful question: why should an American soldier in Ohio die to defend a border in Latvia? They painted the crisis as a purely European problem, a consequence of reckless NATO expansion that had poked the Russian bear. Protests erupted outside the White House, a strange coalition of anti-war activists from the left and nationalist isolationists from the right, all demanding that America pull back from the brink. The administration in power found itself caught in a political vice, pressured by its NATO allies to show strength, while a significant portion of its own electorate demanded retreat. This hesitation, this visible division within the heart of NATO, was not lost on Moscow. Sensing weakness and disunity, the Kremlin decided to press its advantage to test the limits of Western resolve. The first probe was not against a NATO member, but against a nation left vulnerable and isolated by the new map of Europe, Moldova. In the autumn of 2023, citing a staged request for protection from the pro-Russian breakaway region of Transnistria, Russian airborne forces, now based in southern Ukraine, conducted a swift lightning operation. They seized the capital, Chisinau, in less than 72 hours. The West could do nothing but issue condemnations and impose more sanctions, which were now met with open mockery in Moscow. The fall of Moldova sent another chilling message: if you are not under the NATO umbrella, you are on your own. The true test, however, was yet to come. It would not be a frontal assault on the Balti states. That would be too crude, too certain to trigger Article 5. Instead, Russia began a relentless campaign of hybrid warfare designed to destabilize, intimidate, and create a pretext for future action. A massive cyber attack originating from St. Petersburg took down Estonia's banking and power grid for a week. Disinformation campaigns, amplified by bots and local proxies, sought to incite the large Russian-speaking minorities in Latvia and Estonia, claiming they were being oppressed. Border incidents became a weekly occurrence. GPS jamming of civilian airliners, violations of airspace by fighter jets, and the mysterious accidental shelling of an empty field just inside Lithuanian territory. Every incident was a test. Each one forced NATO into an agonizing debate. Was this the attack that triggered Article 5? Is a cyber attack an armed attack? What if pro-Russian separatists, armed and directed by Moscow, seized a municipal building in Narva, an Estonian city on the Russian border? Do you send in the Estonian army and risk a full-scale war? This campaign of ambiguity paralyzed the alliance, exposing the fact that its 20th century trigger was ill-suited for 21st century hybrid warfare. The focus of this new Cold War narrowed to a single strip of land, the Suwalki Gap, the slender 65-kilometer corridor separating the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad from Belarus. If Russia were to seize this land, it would cut the Baltic states off from the rest of NATO. It became the most heavily militarized, most dangerous piece of real estate on the planet. In response to this new, terrifying reality, a panicked rush to rearm began. NATO members, many of whom had let their defense spending languish for decades, suddenly pledged to meet and exceed the 2% of GDP target. But money could not instantly create armies. The defense industrial base of Europe had withered during the long years of peace. Order books for new tanks, ammunition, and air defense systems were years long. It takes 5 years to build a new frigate, 7 years to train a fighter pilot. The realization dawned that NATO had a dangerous window of vulnerability, a gap of perhaps a decade between recognizing the threat and having the military capacity to truly deter it. The alliance was a hollow giant. It had the political declarations, the flags, and the headquarters, but on the ground in the east, its forces were outnumbered and outgunned by a now battle-hardened, confident, and forward-deployed Russian military. NATO was under fire not just from the outside but from within. Its unity was a facade, its military was in a race against time, and its most powerful member was crippled by internal division. The ultimate guarantor of European security was beginning to look like a paper tiger, and the whole world was watching. For the West, the fall of Ukraine was a catastrophe. For the Kremlin, it was a coronation. The swift, decisive victory was not just a military achievement, it was a spiritual and ideological rebirth. The greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, as Vladimir Putin had once called the collapse of the Soviet Union, had, in his eyes, been avenged. Russia, after decades of perceived humiliation and encirclement, had kicked down the door to the 21st century and announced its return as a superpower. In a televised address to the nation, broadcast from the heart of the Kremlin, Putin framed the war not as a conquest, but as a painful but necessary act of historical justice. He spoke of reuniting ancient Russian lands, of liberating a brotherly people from a foreign-sponsored neo-Nazi clique, and of ending the unipolar moment of American dominance. This was the birth of a new Russia, sovereign, powerful, and unafraid to write its own rules. The speech ended with the formal absorption of the liberated territories of Ukraine into the Russian Federation, a move rubber-stamped by a subservient Duma the very next day. Domestically, the victory unleashed a tidal wave of state-sponsored patriotism not seen since the end of the Second World War. The state propaganda machine, already formidable, went into overdrive. The letter Z, once a simple military marking, became a ubiquitous national symbol, emblazoned on everything from billboards to schoolbooks. The official narrative was simple and brutally effective. Russia had not started a war, it had ended one, a war that the West had been waging against it by proxy for years. Any dissenting voices were ruthlessly silenced. The last vestiges of independent media were shut down. New laws were passed, making it a crime punishable by 15 years in prison to spread false information about the special military operation. The victory justified the repression. To be against the war was now to be against Russia itself, a traitor to a nation in its moment of glory. For the vast majority of the Russian people, fed a relentless diet of triumphalist news, the story was one of national greatness restored. This new aggressive confidence sent a shockwave of fear through Russia's near abroad. The former Soviet republics, which had spent 30 years carefully balancing their relationships between Moscow and the West, now understood that the game had changed. The buffer was gone. Moscow's sphere of influence was no longer a matter of diplomacy and economic leverage. It was a matter of direct military threat. In Tbilisi, Georgia, which had fought its own war with Russia in 2008, the government publicly and formally renounced its long-held ambition to join NATO, calling it a provocative and unrealistic goal. In Kazakhstan, the government in Astana, once a careful balancer of Russian, Chinese, and Western interests, began a quiet purge of pro-Western officials and cracked down on nationalist movements that expressed anti-Russian sentiment. Armenia, feeling abandoned by the West in its own regional conflicts, tilted decisively into Moscow's security orbit. The message was clear: you are with us or you are next. The concept of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, had been transformed from a cultural idea into a hard power doctrine. Having shattered the Western-led order, Russia now moved to create a new one. It became the center of gravity for an informal alliance of nations united by their shared resentment of American power, an axis of the aggrieved. Iran, a longtime pariah state, became a key strategic partner. In exchange for Russian political cover and advanced military technology, Tehran supplied Moscow with thousands of the attack drones that had been refined in Middle Eastern conflicts. North Korea, in exchange for food, fuel, and sanctions relief, opened up its vast, aging stockpiles of artillery shells, solving Russia's logistical needs for occupying a country the size of Ukraine. The most crucial relationship, however, was with Beijing. China watched Russia's victory with a mixture of admiration and quiet opportunism. While publicly calling for peace, it offered Moscow a vital economic lifeline, buying up its sanctioned oil and gas at a steep discount and providing the microchips and industrial components Russia could no longer source from the West. A new no-limits partnership was declared, yet it was a deeply unequal one. Russia, the triumphant military power, was now becoming the economic junior partner, the resource-rich vassal to China's manufacturing and technological might. Russia had served as the battering ram, violently breaking the Western order, while China stood ready to patiently build a new, Sino-centric one in its place. With its victory secured and its new alliances in place, Russia began to actively export its model of governance. This was its new challenge to the West, an alternative to liberal democracy. The Russian model was a potent cocktail of strongman authoritarian rule, fervent nationalism, state-controlled capitalism, and the cynical use of traditional values as a political tool. It celebrated order over freedom, the state over the individual, and sovereignty over international law. This model found a receptive audience. In parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, where there was lingering resentment over Western colonialism and interventionism, Russia was welcomed not as a conqueror but as a balancer. It offered military support, nuclear technology, and political partnership with no lectures on human rights or democracy. It was a purely transactional world order, and for many leaders it was a deeply attractive one. The rise of a new Russian empire was not just a territorial phenomenon. It was the start of a new global ideological struggle, a contest to define the very meaning of power and governance in the 21st century. The fall of Ukraine was not a regional European conflict. It was a global event. It was the moment the post-Cold War era, with its assumptions of American primacy and the inevitable march of liberal democracy, came to a final, violent end. A new, chaotic and brutally competitive world order was born. And in this new world, the primary beneficiary of Russia's violent gamble was not Russia itself, but the silent, patient power watching from the east, the People's Republic of China. For years, the defining geopolitical narrative had been the brewing rivalry between the United States and China. Russia's war in Ukraine did not end this rivalry, it supercharged it, but in a way Washington had never anticipated. The United States, the self-proclaimed indispensable nation, was now indispensably tied down. Its military resources, its diplomatic attention, and its political will were all being consumed by the black hole of the new Iron Curtain in Europe. Every Javelin missile sent to Poland, every F-35 squadron deployed to Romania, was a resource not available for the Pacific. Beijing watched and waited and profited. While the West engaged in a costly and debilitating economic war with Russia, China became Moscow's indispensable economic partner. It bought sanctioned Russian oil and gas at bargain prices, fueling its industrial machine while Europe shivered. It sold Russia the dual-use technologies from semiconductors to drones that allowed the Kremlin to sustain its occupation and weather the storm of Western sanctions. Russia had won the war, but in the peace that followed, it was becoming an economic vassal to Beijing, a resource-rich junior partner in a partnership where China made all the rules. This strategic distraction allowed China to accelerate its own ambitions with newfound impunity. In the South China Sea, its maritime patrols became more aggressive. Its diplomatic pressure on Taiwan intensified, testing the island's defenses with a constant stream of air and naval incursions. The American security guarantee, which had once seemed absolute, was now stretched thin across two continents. The question in Taipei, Tokyo, and Seoul was no longer if America would come to their aid, but if it could. Beyond the Great Power Triangle, the world fractured. The Global South, a diverse collection of nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, refused to fall in line with the Western narrative of a simple battle between democracy and autocracy. For many, this was not their fight. Some, remembering centuries of Western colonialism and more recent interventions in Iraq and Libya, saw Russia's defiance of the US-led order with a degree of quiet admiration. They saw a bully finally getting a punch in the nose. Moscow skillfully exploited this sentiment. It offered a transactional model of partnership, Russian arms, security contractors, and UN vetoes in exchange for resources and diplomatic support. No strings attached, no lectures on human rights. This was deeply appealing to leaders who had chafed under Western pressure for decades. In the Sahel region of Africa, Russian-backed military juntas consolidated their power, pushing out former French and American influences. A new scramble for Africa was underway, this time fought with drones, disinformation, and mercenaries. This new global landscape gave rise to a new Cold War, but unlike the first, this was not a neat bipolar contest between two ideologies. It was a chaotic, multipolar struggle fought in the shadows. Economic warfare became a permanent feature of international relations. The US-led sanctions regime against Russia forced the creation of an alternative financial system, centered around China's currency, the yuan, and new platforms designed to bypass the SWIFT banking system. The globalized economy, which had defined the previous 30 years, began to crack and splinter into competing blocs. Proxy wars flared up in the world's forgotten conflicts. Espionage and cyber warfare reached unprecedented levels of intensity, blurring the line between peace and war. Every election, every social protest, every energy pipeline was a potential battlefield in this new, undeclared global conflict. Most terrifyingly, the nuclear genie, which had been put back in its bottle after the Cold War, was now out again. Russia's victory had taught the world a chilling lesson. Nuclear weapons were not just a tool of deterrence, they were a license for conventional aggression. The Kremlin had successfully used its nuclear shield to hold NATO at bay while it conquered a sovereign nation. For nations in volatile regions, the conclusion was inescapable. To be truly secure, you needed a bomb of your own. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the cornerstone of arms control for half a century, was effectively dead. Iran, now in a strategic alliance with a supportive Russia, accelerated its nuclear program to the brink of weaponization. This, in turn, triggered a frantic response from Saudi Arabia and Turkey, who initiated their own covert programs. In East Asia, debate raged in South Korea and Japan about developing their own nuclear deterrence in the face of an aggressive North Korea and an increasingly powerful China. A new, far more dangerous arms race had begun, one involving more actors with less stable governments and fewer communication channels than the one that had preceded it. This global instability was acutely felt in the Middle East. An emboldened Russia, working hand-in-glove with Iran, solidified its position as the dominant power broker in Syria. It used its bases there to project power across the region, challenging the decades-long American presence. The US, with its attention and resources fixed on Europe, was forced into a gradual retreat. This power vacuum did not lead to peace. It created an open field for regional rivalries to explode, pushing the perennial conflict between Israel and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iran closer to the brink of direct, open war. The fallout from a defeated nation in Eastern Europe had set fires across the entire globe. We are in the mid-2030s. The world did not end after the fall of Ukraine. There was no single cataclysmic nuclear exchange. Instead, the future arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding corrosion of the world we once knew. The Russian victory in 2022 was not just an event, it was a catalyst, a single point of failure that sent the entire global operating system into a cascading collapse. The world that emerged is harder, colder, and more dangerous. It is a world living in the long shadow of that victory. The primary casualty of the new era has been confidence, specifically the West's confidence in its own values. The democratic project, which had seemed so triumphant at the end of the 20th century, now appears exhausted and fragile. In the United States, the political division that was exploited during the Ukrainian crisis has become a permanent, unbridgeable chasm. Every election is contested, seen by each side as an existential struggle for the nation's soul. A deep, pervasive isolationism has taken root. The prevailing sentiment is Fortress America, a desire to pull back from the world's intractable conflicts and focus on problems at home, leaving old allies to fend for themselves. In Europe, the dream of an ever closer union is dead. The European Union still exists, but it is a zombie institution. The deep fissure between the hardline East, which lives in constant fear, and the realist West, which has been forced into a grudging, resentful accommodation with the new Russian sphere, has paralyzed it. The principle of consensus is gone, replaced by bitter national interest. Some populist-led governments in Central and Southern Europe have even signed their own bilateral energy and security deals with Moscow, creating a pro-Russian bloc within the EU itself. The Union is a house divided, unable to stand for anything on the world stage. While democracies faltered, the world's autocracies thrived. The Russian victory provided a powerful, seductive proof of concept that might indeed makes right, and that history bends to the will of those ruthless enough to shape it. An authoritarian international has coalesced. It is not a formal alliance like NATO, but a loose, pragmatic network of states dedicated to undermining the democratic world order. Russia provides the military muscle and the nuclear shield. China provides the economic engine and the technological tools of control. Iran, North Korea, and a host of smaller client states serve as regional proxies and disruptors. They actively export their model of governance. The surveillance technologies perfected in Xinjiang are now a major Chinese export, sold to regimes across Africa and Latin America. Russian political consultants, experts in disinformation and election interference, are in high demand from aspiring strongmen. Together, they have created an ideological and technological ecosystem for 21st century dictatorship, one that is proving grimly successful. Democracy is on the defensive, a shrinking island in a rising authoritarian sea. In this fractured world, the institutions designed to keep the peace have withered. NATO is a shadow of its former self. After the United States formally declared that its commitment to Article 5 would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, the alliance's core promise of collective defense was broken. It remains a paper pact, but the trust is gone. The frontline states of Eastern Europe have entered into their own separate defense pacts, scrambling to create a cordon sanitaire against Russia, while Western European members focus on their own national defenses. The shield is broken. This new world order is not stable, it is a tinderbox. The constant friction between the competing blocs has made the possibility of a third world war a daily, palpable reality. It is not a fear whispered in classified briefings, but a topic of open discussion on the news and in family homes. Civil defense drills are now a mandatory part of the school curriculum in many countries. In cities across Europe and Asia, old Cold War-era nuclear fallout shelters have been reopened and restocked. The background radiation of public life is a low-grade, persistent fear. The flashpoints for this potential global conflict are numerous: a renewed clash in the Korean Peninsula, a direct confrontation between Iran and Israel in the Middle East, but the most likely theater of the next Great War is now the High North. As the Arctic ice melts, a frantic race for the region's vast resources of oil, gas, and rare earth minerals has begun. Russia, with its long Arctic coastline and fleet of nuclear icebreakers, has declared the Northern Sea route its own internal waterway and has militarized the region heavily. A clash between a Russian naval patrol and a NATO freedom of navigation mission in these icy, contested waters is seen by many analysts as the most probable spark for a global explosion. The arms race that began in the 2020s has now reached a terrifying new stage. The focus is no longer on just more nuclear warheads, but on weapons that could theoretically win a war before the other side can even react. Hypersonic missiles that travel too fast to be intercepted, swarms of autonomous drones guided by artificial intelligence capable of overwhelming any defense, space-based weapons that can disable an entire continent's communication and navigation systems from orbit. The fear is that a new war would be fought at the speed of algorithms, with strategic decisions made by AI, potentially spiraling out of human control in a matter of minutes. And so this is the world that was born from the fields of a fallen Ukraine, a world divided into hostile blocs, teetering on the brink of a technologically advanced war that could mean the end of civilization, a world where freedom is in retreat and the shadows of autocracy are lengthening. The victory of one nation in one war redefined the future for all nations. It settled a brutal argument about what is possible, what is permissible, and which ideas will shape the human story. It forces us to ask the most fundamental question of all. The great struggle of the 20th century was the battle between democracy, fascism, and communism. Democracy, at great cost, emerged victorious, and we believed that victory was the final word. But what if it was only a temporary armistice? What if the principles of freedom, individual rights, and the rule of law are not the inevitable destination of human progress, but a fragile historical accident? In a world where aggression was rewarded so completely and decisively, we are left with a final, haunting question. If Russia had won, would democracy itself have survived? And so we return. We pull back from the abyss of that other world, that darker timeline, and find ourselves back in our own. The images of a fallen Kiev, a fractured Europe, and a world on the brink of a new global war fade like a bad dream at dawn. The world we have spent the last 2 hours exploring is a fiction, a speculative journey, a ghost of a future that thankfully did not come to pass. That nightmare was averted, that future was held at bay, and it was held at bay not by inevitability, not by the pre-written arc of history, but by choice and by courage. The difference between that timeline and our own was forged in the mud of the Donbass, in the forests outside Kiev, and in the besieged basements of Mariupol. It was decided by the will of ordinary people, teachers, programmers, artists, and farmers, who chose to become soldiers, medics, and volunteers. They chose to resist. It was decided by a president who, when offered a ride to safety, chose instead to ask for ammunition. It was decided by the millions of citizens in Warsaw, Berlin, London, and Washington who opened their homes to refugees and demanded their governments act. It was decided by the fragile, often tested, but ultimately resilient coalition of nations that chose to believe that the sovereignty of one country still mattered to the security of all countries. The line was held. The cost has been and continues to be immense, but it was held. And yet we must not be too quick to congratulate ourselves. The ghosts of that other world remain. They serve as a chilling, necessary reminder, a warning. Alternate history is more than just a parlor game. It is a tool that allows us to see the present with clearer eyes. It strips away the comforting illusion that our world is stable, permanent, and destined for progress. It shows us that history is not a river flowing inevitably to a peaceful sea, but a raging torrent that can be diverted by a single, well-placed stone. The freedom we enjoy is not an inheritance. It is a daily, painstaking construction. It is a fragile ecosystem that requires constant tending, constant vigilance, and at times profound sacrifice. The world we live in today, with all its flaws and challenges, was not guaranteed, it was earned. And the events of 2022 showed us just how quickly, how terrifyingly it could all be lost. The difference between a world of sovereign democracies and a world of resurgent empires can be a matter of a few weeks, a few failed counter-offensives, a single moment of lost resolve. This is the ultimate lesson that lies at the heart of our journey into the darkness. History is not something that happens to us, it is something we create. The choices made in moments of crisis reverberate for generations. Victory or defeat in a single conflict changes not only the fate of the nations involved, but the very ideas that are considered possible for the entire world. It sets the stage for the future, defining the rules of the game, deciding whose values will flourish and whose will wither. To look into the abyss of what might have been is to understand the profound value of what is. It allows us to appreciate the peace we have, the alliances we maintain, and the international order we strive, however imperfectly, to uphold. It reminds us that the future is not yet written. The world of the 2030s and beyond is being forged right now by the decisions we make today. The flame of freedom is not a bonfire that burns on its own. It is a candle carried by each generation through the winds of history. It is easily extinguished by the gusts of tyranny, apathy, and fear. But if shielded by courage, if fueled by conviction, it can light the way through the darkest of nights. The world did not fall because in one corner of Eastern Europe a people refused to let their light go out, and in doing so they shielded us all.